Passivity and Gender, Psychical Inertia and Maternal Stillness by Baraitser. Part 1. Abstract. Who is afraid of passivity? Historically, women and minoritized people have had good reason to be, given that passivity has been a way to keep them out of the world of reason. Freud's move from the activity/passivity binary as the principle of all instinct to its gendering as femininity/passivity and masculinity/activity leads him to assert the repudiation of femininity as the bedrock of psychic life. Freud, S. 1937. Analysis Terminable and Interminable. In the standard edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, 23, 209-254. London, Hogarth Press. This has led to a generative history of feminist, queer, and black psychoanalytic scholarship that constantly reopens the question of female subjectivity and sexuality and what we mean by psychic femininity and masculinity. However, what does remains as bedrock, even in this theorizing, is the figure of the mother in the internal world of the infant, supposedly castrated yet all-powerful, and requiring that the infant defend itself against what is stirred up as a result of dependency on her. After reviewing some of the psychoanalytic debates about femininity, I turn to stillness rather than passivity to suggest that we can identify a maternal element that is on the side of development, a figuration of psychical inertia that holds the capacity for waiting, stopping, ceasing, and withdrawing in a world in which these mental functions are sorely missing. Introduction. Let's start at the end. Freud begins Analysis Terminable and Interminable, 1937, his reflections at the end of his life on the question of cure, with a struggle over the partial failure of analysis. A young Russian, a man spoilt by riches who had come to Vienna in a state of complete helplessness, had made considerable progress in the first years of his analysis, becoming more independent and less depressed. But then, Freud tells us, we came to a full stop, 217. A kind of psychical inertia that he had first described as far back as the Project for a Scientific Psychology, 1895, had appeared to have set in. In Freud's view, the patient had stalled in the face of the historical causes of his neurosis, the working through of which would bring the analysis to an end. Instead, the patient had settled for the relative comforts of what had been achieved so far. Although we can think of this as a defense in a conventional sense of turning away disturbing thoughts and feelings from the conscious mind, Freud hints at a more passive resistance in the face of his own active wish for a cure, closer to the seductive pull into a form of mindlessness that the contemporary Kleinian tradition has parsed from more violent or sadistic attacks on internal objects, complicating the idea of death drive as a single mode of psychic functioning. Bell, 2015. Freud's remedy was to fix an ending date for the treatment. He would meet the patient's full stop with his own, touché. At least initially, this seemed to cause the patient's resistances to crumble away. In the last months of the treatment, the young man produced the prerequisite memories and links to the historical causes of his neurosis that enabled him to recover. However, Freud then rather dolefully reports that his own belief in a cure was short-lived. The patient returned to Vienna towards the end of the First World War as a penniless refugee and had to be helped to master a part of the transference which had remained unresolved, 218. The patient was, of course, Sergei Pankejeff, whom Freud had named Wolfman, who appears to have suffered from delusions entailing a conviction that a doctor had drilled a hole in his nose, Brunswick, 1928. Freud's view of this as an unresolved transference suggests it had crossed his mind that the analysis may have made Pankejeff worse rather than better. He concludes this opening section with the statement that he passed the patient over to his junior female colleague, Ruth Mack Brunswick, who periodically cleared up Pankejeff's attacks for the rest of his life. In handing over the interminable clearing up to Brunswick, whilst he nursed his disappointment at the failure of a definitive cure in the face of a stubborn psychical inertia, Freud unwittingly already places us in a scene of gender and psychical passivity. I have noted elsewhere that in psychoanalysis the term sex and gender are not used very frequently. Instead, psychoanalysis gives primacy to sexuality as the drive that inhabits and determines psychic reality, and sexual difference as the unstable achievement of the drive's maturation. In Freud's view, sexuality is the product of the pressure put on the mind by the instinct, and its structuring occurs through the primal fantasy of castration that leads to the psychic positions masculinity and femininity. Here I will use the term gender interchangeably with sexual difference, however, in keeping with the direction of travel currently in both sociological and psychoanalytic terminology. See Baraitser, 2019, for further discussion about terminology. By the end of Analysis Terminable and Interminable, we encounter Freud's famous statement about the bedrock of analysis that ties passivity back to psychic femininity and indeed to the sexed female body. We can find many instances in Freud's work where he puts into question the pairings femininity/passivity and masculinity/activity, and maintains the predominance of psychic bisexuality whereby masculinity and femininity are uncoupled from biological sex and are only ever precariously attained psychic identifications. However, in this late, pessimistic text, he finds himself back with the primal fantasy of castration, the question of sexual difference and passivity. There are two themes, he tells us in the closing paragraphs, which give the analyst an extraordinary amount of trouble, 250. They are connected with the differences between the sexes and entail a common factor that is expressed differently in each, the differential fate of masculine striving that propels both men and women away from the psychic meaning of castration. The striving itself is not masculine as such. Although Freud does at times use activity as synonymous with masculinity, and passivity with femininity, activity and passivity are used by Freud as the defining characteristics of specific types of instinctual aims that structure mental life prior to the oppositions between phallic and castrated, or masculine and feminine, Laplanche and Pontalis, 1973. In Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, 1915, for instance, Freud maintains every drive is a piece of activity, 122, including a drive with a passive aim. Indeed, given the aim of every drive is satisfaction and that this can be achieved through a change from activity to passivity, 127, such as in sadomasochism, passivity is always paradoxically infused with a certain force even as its aim is to dissipate excitement. Passivity is not an absence of striving as such but a certain kind of striving. Whether a psychical investment in masochism, in inertia that comes from the binding of libido to certain objects, or after, beyond the pleasure principle, in repetition and ultimately a striving or deviation towards death that is the arc of a life. Freud, 1920. Masculine striving should be understood, then, as a particular striving towards the masculine as a flight from castration. It is egosyntonic, Freud tells us, in males. What is repressed in the process is the passive attitude, since it necessitates the assumption of castration, 252. In a footnote, Freud clarifies, "We must not be misled by the term masculine protest into supposing that what the man is repudiating is his passive attitude, as such, what might be called the social aspect of femininity. Such a view is contradicted by an observation that is easily verifiable, namely that such men often display a masochistic attitude, a state that amounts to bondage, towards women. What they reject is not passivity in general, but passivity towards a male. In other words, the masculine protest is in fact nothing else than castration anxiety." 252. Passivity in men can be tolerated in the presence of women, but must be repudiated in relation to other men as an echo of the Oedipal drama. Indeed, as a recapitulation of a very old story, femininity/passivity only functions as the other to masculinity/activity, as a relation, that is, to men, and not as a psychic position in and of itself. Point 2, it is the association with lack that is attributed to women, the missing phallus that men want to get rid of in relation to other men. In females, there is also a masculine striving, Freud tells us, that is egosyntonic up until the phallic phase where development in the direction of femininity sets in, after which it is subject to a momentous process of repression. 251. The form this masculine striving takes in the phallic phase is the unsatisfied wish for a penis that is destined to be converted into a wish for a child, and for a man who possesses a penis. This leads Freud to conclude that the two corresponding themes that cause analysts so much trouble, and that in the end cannot be worked through, are, in women, envy of the penis, the striving after the possession of a male genital, and, in men, the struggle against their passive or feminine attitude towards other men. 250. Nothing, he suggests, can really persuade us to give up these wishes. Freud notes that Adler had originally called this shared attitude to the castration complex a masculine protest, which, Freud states, in the case of men, is exactly right. But from the beginning, he tells us, he would have preferred the phrase repudiation of femininity. 250. It is femininity that is repudiated in both men and women, figured as passivity in men and penis envy in women, but both a result of a flight from anticipated or corroborated castration. Here, analysis terminable and interminable itself comes to a full stop. Freud struggles with the question of cure, with a psychical inertia that puts a stop to the process of understanding what disturbs us, ends with his return to familiar territory. In the place of the disturbance of stasis itself, he puts castration, and ultimately femininity, a lack that at least he knows the contours of, and that mitigates the anxieties of passivity as a state of deathly inaction that has no shape. Psychical inertia gives way to the safety of a form of knowing that at the root of psychic life is the fear of the feminine. Freud's move to position femininity as a placeholder for the anxieties of an amorphous and threatening passivity was protested in his lifetime and has prompted many new approaches to femininity. 3. Female sexuality and motherhood over the last 100 years, both within psychoanalysis and beyond. Extensive discussions have taken place in the field of psychoanalytic feminism, particularly in the French and Anglophone worlds, in critical theory, gender and sexuality studies, trans studies, and more recently at the intersections between critical race studies and psychoanalysis. Many have identified not just the misogyny, but also the racism that is tied into Freud's theorization of passivity. Given Freud's linking of the dark continent of female sexuality with the colonial notion of the primitive that racializes those deemed other to the white European subject, Abel, Christian, and Moglen 1997, Holmes 2021, Kana 2003, Preciado 2021. Yet, at the same time, these fields have sought to re-engage with the ongoing emancipatory promise of a psychoanalytic theory of psychosexuality that offers complex ways to think about difference per se. As Juliet Mitchell argued many decades ago, 1974, if we cannot theorize how difference structures psychic life, we have no way to understand the persistence of social and political structures of difference. Whether patriarchy, as she argued, or white supremacy, as the psychoanalyst Dorothy Holmes draws our attention to, 2021, or Whether patriarchy, as she argued, or white supremacy, as the psychoanalyst Dorothy Holmes draws our attention to, 2021, or homophobia and transphobia, as Paul Preciado describes, 2021, let alone begin to change them. And as Judith Butler has shown, difference in psychic life is not just a product of unconscious internal fantasy prompted by the awareness of the difference between the sexes, but via the mechanism of melancholia in which the ego is formed as a result of incomplete mourning of lost objects. The social world and its already structured differences gets in to the psychic world and shapes the very psychical agencies that come to organize it. 1997. We might then ask, what is at stake now when we reconsider the conjunction femininity/passivity or masculinity/passivity? Is passivity really gendered? Do we need a concept of passivity to understand sexual difference? Can we do without it? Or is there something productive, even, in thinking, with passivity rather than passing it like the hot potato of psychoanalytic theory, between men and women, between the effective male European subject and its many others? Who, after all, is afraid of passivity? There are good historical reasons why women and minoritized people have been afraid of it. Freud inherits a history in Western metaphysical thought, and its importation to other parts of the globe via colonization that links passive matter, the body, nature, and emotion, the opposite of reason, to both the feminine and the primitive. That continues to have very real social effects for women and minoritized people. These are discourses that have long underpinned the exclusion of women and minoritized people from what are seen as rational activities. The hierarchized dualisms of nature/culture, private/public, emotion/reason, body/mind, and passive/active run from Aristotle's 1995 notion of woman matter as passive by nature, and man form spirit as active and creative, through to 19th century biological determinist and eugenicist views. Geddes and Thompson, for example, wrote in 1889 that social, psychological, and behavioral traits are caused by metabolic states. In the language of mechanics that Freud also drew on, women are anabolic, making them passive, conservative, sluggish, stable, and therefore uninterested in politics, whilst men, being catabolic, are eager, energetic, passionate, variable, and interested in political and social matters. Geddes and Thompson, 1889. These biological facts were used to shape the social and political rights of women, and by extension those racialized through the expansion of empire, under the guise that what was decided among the prehistoric protozoa cannot be annulled by act of parliament, quoted from Wa 1999, 18. These kinds of associations have long tendrils right into the present, where we still see the persistence of deterministic discourses linking femininity to passivity. For instance, in contemporary accounts of the biology of sex and gender that continue to describe ova as passive and spermatozoa as active, despite these descriptions being scientifically debunked, Martin 1991. The literature on the racialization of passivity is equally stark, linking passivity with docility and laziness and pathologizing, Black Rage, Stout 2021, in ways not dissimilar to the pathologization of feminist protest as a form of hysteria. Whilst being characterized as docile, black women under conditions of slavery were forced to be permanently active through enforced labor, reproduction, and sexuality, without access to passivity that remained the discourse of white femininity. Critical race theorist Joy James argues that in contemporary life what she calls the maternal captive goes on being a site of both extraction and exclusion. The maternal captive is held in place by what she calls womb theory that imagines reproducing itself without the simultaneous labor and locking out of black voices, of which psychoanalytic theory has historically been an example. James 2016. In a similar vein, Christina Sharp writes in Ordinary Notes about the possibilities of stillness, rather than passivity or fear in the face of the fact that there is no set of years in which to be born black and woman would not be met with violence. Sharp 2023, 131. Reflecting on moments of stillness in Toni Morrison's Beloved, stillness can be the stillness of exhaustion brought on by interminable labor, but also the stillness that holds the possibility for rearranging black life. Sharp calls stillness angrammatical, in that words shift their meanings when they come up against blackness. She writes, "Beloved started me thinking about stillness and its angrammatical life for Black people. Started me thinking about Black. Still. Life, 241. Here stillness rearranges Black life as what endures beyond mere endurance or survival by creating the possibilities of existence, a life." The move to stillness also speaks to a question of care that is connected to discourses of Black life, femininity, and passivity. She writes, "Care is complicated, gendered, misused. It is often mobilized to enact violence, not assuage it, yet I cannot surrender it. I want acts and accounts of care as shared and distributed risk, as mass refusals of the unbearable life, as total rejections of the dead future." 333. Given the social distribution of care and the historical and current misuses of the binary femininity/passivity for purposes that neither support nor enhance the lives of all women, the question about its use in psychoanalytic theory and practice might then be whether we repetitively reinscribe a relation between femininity and passivity, because without it we no longer quite know what femininity refers to as a psychoanalytic term. If we reject passivity and couple both maternity and femininity with psychic forms and structures of care, love, and receptivity instead, do we not reinscribe in psychic life the collective failure of redistributing and sharing care? Further, if we degender passivity and activity, what does this do to our understandings of the drives, the body, sexuality, and sexual difference? And if, as I will argue below, passivity may be a psychic and social capacity that needs to be fostered, does it, along with its gendering, need to be so forcefully repudiated? Does Freud highlight something important, in other words, with his notion of psychical inertia, that may enable us to conceive it as a refusal to move on, a wish to stop, that may be akin to sharp stillness, and may be understood as an important state of mind, even a psychic achievement? Passivity understood as the mental capacity for withdrawing. For instance, from rampant consumption and unsustainable growth, is vital if we are to interrupt the business as usual of what some term heteropatriarchal racial capital, as it burns up the earth. For stopping would also mean interrupting the historical reality that there is no set of years in which to be born Black and woman would not be met with violence. Can we multiply our understandings of unconscious forms of psychical inertia that may have a bearing on some of the predicaments that the world finds itself in? A world intent on the destruction of the biosphere, the criminalization of many forms of resistance, enforced migration, war and mass displacement, economic instability, and escalating violence directed against women and sexual minorities globally? In what follows, I briefly rehearse some of the psychoanalytic feminist responses to the Freudian binary femininity/passivity, focusing on a key point of tension between Juliet Mitchell's Law of the Mother, 2022, and Judith Butler's notion of the law that governs sexual difference in unconscious life as mutable and open to social change, 2012. This is by no means a comprehensive review of the significant debates in psychoanalytic understandings of femininity and female sexuality, which would include important contributions from Jessica Benjamin, Dana Berkstead-Breen, 1993, Janine Shaskets-Mergel, Patricia Garavazai, Letitia Glosser-Fiorini, Luce Irigaray, Julia Kristeva, Alexandra Lemma, Rosine Perelberg, Jacqueline Rose, and many others. It is an attempt, however, to historicize the questions I have raised above and to maintain an intergenerational discussion amongst psychoanalysts and scholars invested in understanding the unconscious meanings of sexual difference. Simone de Beauvoir was one of the first outside of psychoanalytic theory to offer a cogent critique of Freud's linking of femininity with passivity, questioning the value he placed on virility, his lack of an account of a feminine libido, and his suggestion that for women to claim their femininity, they must sacrifice their independence and agency. They must accept the price of castration, which is passivity and receptivity, 1949, 1972. Yet to have no theory of the unconscious life of sexual difference leaves us with a flat and superficial reading of gender as simply a social construct. A psychoanalytic theory of sexual difference that maintains a disruptive and polymorphous perverse sexuality at the heart of the human subject, that is incompletely bound through the sexually differentiating process of Oedipus, goes a long way towards understanding how difference produces psychic life. But if difference is only ever structured around a binary, whether masculine/feminine, passive/active, father/mother, or law/body, rather than a more multiple set of differences between multiple terms, we remain, at least in Luce Irigaray's view, with only one term, the masculine, and not with two, as binaries tend towards hierarchies in which difference is actually suppressed. Activity subsumes and dominates passivity, 1985. The persistence of these binaries has therefore been a central concern in feminist, queer and trans debates about the limits of psychoanalytic accounts of both the sexual and difference. 5 equally. However, accounts that emerge from the object relations tradition and draw on notions of primary femininity or the formative relation with an already gendered maternal body and its contents both appeal to and also fail to provide adequate answers to the question of sexual difference. After rehearsing some of these debates, I briefly returned to this question of the value of passivity in reference to a certain kind of necessary stasis, Baraitser 2020. I argue for a form of life within death that is distinct from the life drive as Freud conceives it, and may offer a model for the psychic capacity to stop, withdraw, and wait, whilst remaining on the side of life.